Okay, so let us continue. So now, let us discuss what are the difference between the traditional assessment versus authentic assessment, guys. For you to utilize or for you to know what are the things that or what are the type of assessment that you have to use po para po mas maintindihan natin or mas malaman po natin yung strength po ni student and at the same time their learning process or their learning engagement and another thing po to know their weakness and lastly to engage them po in more specific ideas po para po mas malaman po natin kung natuto po si student sa atin or hindi. So we have traditional assessment versus authentic assessment. So again, one of the basic but the most important task of a teacher is to assess the learning of the students. Again, one of the basic or the most important task of a teacher, tulad ng sinabi ko kanina, hindi lang po tayo, hindi lang po teaching ang gampanin natin, kundi po our most or the most important thing that we should conduct to our student is to conduct the type of learning or the learning process or the assessment of the learning that they have. Okay? So, we have traditional assessment. Describe po muna natin ulit para mas maintindihan natin. So, when we say traditional assessment, we answer the question, what do students know? Okay? So, teacher should know if the test is the best way to assess the student. Okay? Kasi kung mabalikan natin, when we say traditional assessment, this is a test assessment. And for me, as an educator, not all the learnings of the student could be assessed through a test or a paper and pencil assessment. Tama ba? Another thing about traditional assessment, this is objective. When we say objective, meaning that they have right or wrong specific answers. So what are those? So we have the tests and quizzes, the multiple choice, fill in the blanks, matching types, true or false, and the others. Okay? So we could always or it is always have an answer. So ibig sabihin po, when we conduct traditional assessment, we could identify the specific answer because these have only one specific answer po. So another thing about traditional or test assessment na tinatawag natin, the traditional assessment, if you know how to make questionnaire on the Google form and then put the answer key, that is a very important thing or that is a very easy way for us to assess the learning of the students here. So, ibig sabihin po, si traditional assessment po, pag gumamit po tayo ng traditional assessment, ang dali niya lang checkan, ang dali niya lang gawan ng assessment because it varies or we have the type of questions that we could identify or we could alam mo yon, pwede po mag-exchange paper, pwede po natin magkaroon ng or pwede po mag-conduct ang bata ng peer judgment kasi po there are specific answers that they could vary or they could say that they are right or wrong. Okay? So, another thing, in traditional assessment, this is easy automated and the type of questions or the students will just, what is this? Identify, define, ano pa ba? Name, match the test, which is typically used in the lower level of Bloom's taxonomy. Tama ba? So in traditional assessment po, this is a very important type of testing, but it's just test the lower level of Bloom's taxonomy po. So ibig sabihin, when the student define, name, and match the test or match the item, that is a very lower or that is a very shallow factor of knowing if the students learn because it could be copied, we could cheat, tama ba, sa traditional assessment, and at the same time, students would be also confident kasi they have reviewed and memorized a specific idea or learnings. Let us remember na hindi po lahat ng minimemorize ay naiintindihan. Tama ba? Okay? And that is a very important thing that we should understand about traditional assessment. Hindi ko naman po sinasabi na traditional assessments is ineffective, but if we want to really assess the learning of the student, traditional assessment is not helpful. Tama? So what are the tips in writing an effective test? So ito po idea natin, no? Let me give you these tips po on how would you write an effective test if you are going to use traditional assessment. So number one, align with learning targets. So the teacher should conduct or know what specific item is targeting. For example po, sa multiple choice, ang kinakandak po natin is remembering stage ng bata. For example po, may papakita po ako sa inyo, mga anak. We have here the table of specification. So if you are going to notice, we have here the agenda, we have remembering, okay? We have understanding, applying, analyzation, we have evaluating, and creating po. Okay, tapos po, dito naman po sa table, makikita natin na si 1, 2, 3, under po siya ng remembering. Yung item po na 1, 2, 3. Si number 4 to 5 naman po, under po siya ni understanding. So, that is very helpful when we make an effective test because it should be targeting or it should be varying po dependent dun sa learning style o dun sa target natin na makuha ng bata. And then last, in creating, sa creating naman po usually si bata ay ilalagay po sa isang situation. For example, the students will make or create his own perception or reasoning para po mas maintindihan, para po mas makita natin na si bata po ay natuto not just in accordance with the plain text but rather through influencing and through the help of managing ideas. Okay? And pag sinabi naman po natin evaluating, ang example questions po natin ng evaluate is true or false. Tama po? Si evaluation po, under po siya ay si true or false po. Through the help of true or false, we could identify or help students to evaluate the learnings that they have. Next. Number 2, confirm purpose. What do you know? What do you want to know from the results of the test? Even po yung test papers natin, no? They should have objectives, they should have goals, able for us to identify the learning of the students here. Okay, so next, number 3, create strong questions. The effective question po, no? The effective question, it should start with W8 question that is based on the educational curriculum of DepEd and CHED. WH question should be used in when we make multiple choice type of question, should ask WH question because there is misconception whenever we do not make or we just give a plain text or plain statement to the students. And letter A po, under creating strong questions, it should be meaningful stems. So when we say meaningful stems, the choices of in the multiple choice should be meaningful and should be close to the exact answer. Number 2, answers options provide information about errors in thinking. Letter C, avoid all of the above and none of the above. Bakit po? Because it increased guessing po sa mga bata na ay wala sa number 2 yung all of the above. Siguro sa number 3, all of the above yung answer. Okay po. Let us create strong questions. Ibig sabihin, yung tipong mapapaisip talaga yung mga estudyante natin, even if that is just a traditional assessment. Number 4, avoid ridiculous distractors. Okay? For example, which among the following are not part of the solar system? And then nilagay mo yung nasa kusina nyo, mga ganon. Ibig sabihin, ridiculous, ang layo po doon sa question natin. Ang layo po doon sa target na answers natin. So that should be close enough and that should be helpful and that should be the type of learning po, or the type of questions that are been close to that question. Number 4, provide clear directions, of course. If that is to encircle, write encircle. If that is to put on, or that is to underline, or that is to put before the number, then therefore provided. Number 5, consider overall structure and sequence. So when we say structure and sequence, we have to remember um, when we make exams po, make sure naman po sana na na kung ano yung unang tinuro natin, yun yung mga nasa prior or nasa unahang questions. And then po doon naman po sa mga susunod na questions, yun naman po yung mga dulo-dulo na. Okay, para po hindi maintindihan si bata kapag nag-review. Okay po. And then, what are the things that we could learn more from this? We also have the authentic assessment or performance assessment. So when we say authentic or performance assessment, what can students do? Okay po. So when a teacher po pala get the learning or doesn't get po the learning level of students in traditional assessment, authentic assessment is a better choice. Okay, so bakit po? So this answers the question, what can students do? If we want to know the student skills, authentic assessment works well. Okay, so consider po students who want to learn how to drive. Okay? So, sa traditional assessment po, pwede po nating mapag-aralan or pwede po nating itest yung bata saan ba? Sa traffic rules, sa mga signages kapag nagda-drive. Okay? It could be assessed in traditional assessment. Pero po, but you cannot have license and know how to drive safely if you want to, if you don't try doing it. So, ibig sabihin po, ang function po ni authentic assessment is to really do. Okay, so this is a learning by doing, or allowing students to really learn the specific setup or the specific setting on how to make something possible po. Okay po, example na nga lang po natin yung sa driving. Hindi po matututo sa students kung i-engage po natin sila sa driving lessons lang, kundi po dapat po sila po ay matuto talaga ng driving styles and different ways on how to drive well, enable for them to really identify it as successful in learning po. Okay? So demonstrates of learning do driving tests, papers, presentations, projects, and portfolios. Okay? So let us remember that when we say authentic or performance assessment, they have levels of qualities. It is never a right or wrong answers. And finally, it is a level of mastery that counts in authentic assessments. Ulitin ko, when we say authentic assessment, the level of mastery counts here po. Okay. So, in authentic assessment po, we have rubrics and checklists. When we say rubrics po, ang function po ni rubrics, that is that is the scoring guide na tinatawag. This is usually the matrix of, or this is usually in matrix or in tables po. Okay, I believe you have seen rubrics naman po. And checklist. When we see checklist naman po, this is the list of expectation, usually or in step or the process. Okay, so another thing about authentic assessment, typically for higher or level of on Bloom's taxonomy, not easily automated. Kung si traditional assessment, madali pong ma-checkan, madaling i-record, madaling ma-identify yung learning style or yung learning ni student. Kay authentic assessment naman po, hindi. It requires human, okay? It requires human to measure them. It requires rubrics, it requires checklist. Mamaya po papakitaan ko po kayo ng rubrics para mas maintindihan natin. So typically po, si authentic assessment po, this requires complex tasks and we know that. Okay? But don't worry, the more pressure, the more complex, the more you will learn. Yan po yung build nating mindset sa mga bata, sa mga future students natin, and for us also, habang nag-aaral pa kayo. So, what are the tips that I could give you in writing an effective authentic assessment? Number 1, align with learning targets. Okay? So, ibig sabihin, we should always align the assessment in the learning targets of the students. We should not require students to learn what we don't or what we did not teach po to them. Tama? Okay? And at the same time, di ba po kanina pinakita ko sa TOS natin, may mga learning targets tayo. If your learning target for the student is to remember, just to remember a specific idea, then therefore go with it. Okay po? If your learning target for the student, most especially in authentic assessment, is to engage them, to create, or to evaluate, then therefore make an assessment that would make them engage in that specific target. Confirm purposes. What do you want to know from the results of the assessment? Okay. And create rubrics. Provide clear directions. Consider a checklist of students. Okay. Or steps. And consider setting or a context or an audience. So that are the tips that I could give in authentic assessment. Consider the checklist po, no? Lagi po tating i-require ang mga students natin na i-consider po yung procedure na binibigay natin. Okay? Or else, they will fail. Kasi po, following direction is a very or must in doing an assessment or doing an activity for the students. Okay? So next, tips for writing an effective rubrics. So what would a good performance look like? Okay? Set criteria. When we say criteria, ito po yung nakalagay dito. Prioritize criteria, establish level of quality, use an even numbers of qualities, use the rubrics to teach the assignment. So I will show you an example of a rubric. So this is a rubric. Let me show you. So this is an example of rubric. So we have the criteria or the category, we have the comprehension, for example, analysis, interpretation, writing skills, and mechanics. So that is the criteria. You should set that into general to specific. Ano yung pinaka-importante? Dapat po yun yung nasa pinaka-unahan or pinaka-mataas. Okay po. And next, sabi dito, prioritize criteria, yes. Establish levels of qualities. When we say level of qualities, ito po yun. Is the performance of the student excellent? Okay. So when we say excellent, it exceeds standards po. And when we say good, that is occasionally exceeds. Okay. And the performance of the student is well enough, guided with the rubrics. Is it acceptable? Ibig sabihin, it meets the standards or unacceptable, below standards po. So when we see or when we look at the point system or pointing system po, sabi sa last factor or last tip, use an even number of qualities or use the rubrics to teach the assignment. Okay? So, ibig sabihin, di ba, if we notice here, we use even numbers, 20 points, 15 points. Hindi ka po pwede magbigay na ng 20 points tapos 3 points na pagtapos. Or kaya naman 20 points, 19 points pagtapos po. So, that is not valid po in making a rubric. And lastly po, use the rubric to teach the assignment. So, assignment is very important in authentic assessment. Okay? So, authentic assessment should be more engaging if you will notice. So, kailan po natin ginagamit si rubrics kapag performance task po ang basehan nung assessment nung bata. Okay. And last but not the least, in making a rubrics, it should be well performed. Okay. And at the same time, and it should be visually observed by the instructors or the students. Okay. So, that is the difference of authentic and traditional assessment. So if we could notice here, class, so if I will ask you, what will you use, traditional or authentic assessment? Syempre po mas complex po gawin yung authentic assessment. Pero dyan po kasi talaga natin mame-measure yung learning ng bata. Okay? So that is very important. That is a very important factor that we should know or we should engage them. Okay, so let us continue. So according to Wiggins, while standardized multiple choice tests can be valid indicators or predictors of academic performance, tests often mislead students into believing that learning is cramming and mislead teachers into believing tests are after the fact. That is true. Okay? Akala natin kapag ang bata po ay nabigyan natin ng test paper and they answer it correctly, dyan na po nakabase or nag-value yung learning ng bata, and that is not true. It just give students believing that learning is cramming and mislead teachers also to believing that tests are after the fact. Ibig sabihin, this is contriving or irrelevant po. Okay? So, wag po tayo mag-focus or wag po tayo mag-end na ang bata ay natututo sa test paper. So, a move towards more authentic test task an outcome, improve teaching and learning. Authentic assessment helps students see themselves as active participants, okay, who are working on a task of relevance rather than passive recipients or obscure facts. It helps teachers by encouraging them to reflect on the relevance of what they teach and provides results that are useful for improving instructions. Okay? So what are the um here pala in authentic assessment po. So authentic assessment po in this area often ask question to analyze, to synthesize, and apply what they have learned in substantial manner po. And students create new meaning in the process, okay? And in authentic learn assessment po, often far more direct, it gives more direct of application and construction of knowledge. It's more of creating, it's more of engaging, it's more of evaluating po. Okay? So, according to Mueller, authentic assessment po focus on the learning process, sound instructional practices, and high-level thinking skills and proficiency needed to success for the success in the real world. And therefore, um, many of our students who have been exposed to them huge advantage over those who have not. Okay, so sa traditional assessment naman po, since this is just a test assessment, okay, so this is taken in the paper pencil that are usually true or false. This assessment po are easily to grade, but only test isolated applications. Remember that. When we say traditional assessment, it's just test isolated functions or isolated applications, which is the facts or memorizations po. Okay, so that's not always applicable in learning targeted or in assessment of the student. So learners, let us remember, learners must use more complex higher order thinking skills in order for them to identify as successful in learning process. So what are the criticisms for in authentic assessment? So criticism of authentic assessment generally involve both of the informal development of the assessments and difficulty in ensuring test validity or reliability given the subjective nature of human scoring rubrics as compared to the computer scoring multiple choice test items. So isa daw po sa criticism sa authentic assessment since gumagamit daw po ng human ability sa testing or sa scoring guide po, hindi po siya parehas ni traditional assessment na gumagamit po tayo ng computers, 'di ba? We have or we could just imply or implicate there the answer keys. Okay? So nagkakaroon daw po ng bias sa authentic assessment. Sometimes they use student-teacher relationship in testing or in guiding po dito sa critic or sa authentic assessment po. So, ano pong makakatulong sa atin para po mas maging valid po si authentic assessment? Tinatawag nating panel judgment. Hindi lang po isang teacher or hindi lang po isang advice ang magbibigay. Meron pwede din po ang peer judgment, classmate, pwede din pong ibang teacher. Kaya po dapat si authentic assessment, hindi lang po siya nagva-vary sa isang scoring guide or hindi lang po si rubric, isa ang nag-grade, kundi marami pong factor or maraming tao. So based on the value of authentic assessments to student outcomes, the advantage of authentic assessments outweighs these concerns. Yes. Okay. So, let us continue. So we have the benefits of authentic assessment. Okay po. Sa benefit of authentic assessment, basahin na lang po natin yan. Since ano lang po yan, nabigay na po natin siya kanina. So authentic assessment, use tasks and reflect normal classroom activities that would help them po to be engaged in a classroom setups. Okay? That's why attendance is a very important factor in checking the ability and assessing a student. Okay? And authentic assessment focuses on the higher thinking skills, what I've mentioned earlier. Authentic assessment embeds assessment in the classroom context. It requires active performance. Okay? It promotes a wide range of assessment strategies. Take note of this. This is included on your midterm exam. involves the teachers and students collaboratively in determining assessment. One of the factor, one of the benefits, one of the important thing about authentic assessment is that it helps to build the rapport between the teacher and the student po. It focuses on the progress rather than identifying the weakness of the students. Okay? So, ibig sabihin po, with the help of authentic assessment, we could identify what is the progress or development of the students and how would, as you guys, future educators, as educator, would help you or the students to be more um, effective on the coming learnings that we are going to teach to you. Okay? So rather than identifying the weakness, in authentic assessment po, we're not going to deal more of the weaknesses of the students, but rather, we will help them improve. Magkaiba po yan. Okay? Kasi minsan, nadidil lang pong weakness, tapos hinahayaan na natin si bata. Hindi po ganun. The benefits of authentic assessment, we help, we develop, we do progression on the learning assessment or the learning style of the student. So what are the frameworks of this authentic assessment? When we say frameworks, what are the important factors that we have considered in authentic assessment? Number one, the assessment task, of course. The physical context. Bakit po kasama sa physical context sa frameworks ng authentic assessment? Kasi ulitin natin, when we say authentic assessment, this is more of engaging. That's why this is more of physical activities that not just um, measure of intelligence, hindi lang po ganon, kundi po it measures the physical context of the student. The social context, because we also build and reflect with the community standards po, and at the same time, we build the social factors of the students. And last but not the least, we have the assessment in results or forms. With the use of rubrics and checklists, we could identify the learnings of the students. And last po, ito pala yung last, assessment criteria. We should be very careful in making the criteria and measuring the assessment. Kaya kung mapapansin po natin, when we make rubrics po, lagi pong may points for effort. Okay? Kaming mga teachers, whenever we do assessment po, we always give points for efforts because we identify the performance of the students, not just on the ways on how they make the activities or performance, but rather on the efforts they exert to it. And when we say authentic assessment, this is not graded po group in a group form, but rather this is graded individually because we know that different students have different learning styles, and at the same time, different students have different coping mechanisms. That's why we have to identify the weakness and the strength of the students, to identify what are the learnings and what are the things that we have to develop to them. Okay, so that are the frameworks of authentic assessment. So how to develop authentic assessment? This is the last. Number one, identify standards. So the first step is the identification of performance standards. This is very essential that the standards have real world applications. Number two, develop learning objectives. So when we say developing learning objectives are identifiable. Okay, this is measurable components of the broader standards that have been set. Number three, identify target performance. So when we say identifying target performance, so one needs to identify the skills or performances that match the learning objectives. Okay, so most of the AAs or the authentic assessments po, it promotes higher order cognitive skills. Develop performance criteria. Criteria must be developed. Okay, as I've mentioned earlier, um, there is a very or a massive in advancement of the technology of the curriculum that we are having here in the Philippines. That's why performance criteria also should be improved and should be developed. So criteria must be developed to differentiate po between the different levels of mastery. This should be communicated to the students clearly. That's why when you teach the public school in different school, you have to introduce to them the syllabus or the syllabi of the subjects that you have for them to identify what are the expectation or what are the things that they should expect on the specific subject, and at the same time What are the type of activities or the OBAs that you're going to make at the end of the lessons, of every lessons, and at the end of that specific subjects. Grade scoring rubrics, of course. There is no validity in assessment if the teacher did not make scoring rubrics. Rubric criteria is very important po in authentic assessment. So, ano po yung sabihin nun? So, developing a detailed scoring rubrics let or allow our student to know how grading is done. Okay? Marami tayong student na ganun po in the future. Ma'am, paano po para po kapag at the end of the semester or the quarter po, kapag po si bata humingi ng grade, mapapakita po natin na ganito po yung performance niya. Okay? That's why rubric is very important. So it helps ensuring a fair grading procedures. And last but not the least, it develops or design instructional activities. So how could we develop authentic assessment? We should design instructional activities. There is no assessment if we do not give activity on that particular student. So instructions that are developed should be able to guide students effectively to do the assessment. Okay? So these are the things or these are the ways on how we could identify or how could we develop authentic assessment. So please be guided to these factors because these are included in your midterms. And at the same time, we should use this or we could use this po. We could vary on these ideas once we are on our field already. So thank you for listening, BSE. I hope you have learned today. And if you have any question, just drop it down on our group chat or you could send me PM. Thank you so much and God bless everyone.